goes. I now know to pause for that moment because it is usually one that gets in between things. But I'll kick off here. Sam, as you know, we're headed into module 3 today, which is Take Back the Web. Module 3 is technically the 4th week of kernel, which started in May, and we're now in the middle-ish portion of the program where we're turning the corner from the beginning, which was very much about these people getting to know each other, into kind of the next phase, which is building about 110 interesting projects across the Web3 ecosystem. So a bit about the fellows themselves, some of the people that are on this call, many of whom will listen later. The short answer is it's an incredible group of people from all across the Web3 ecosystem, representing all types of academic backgrounds, perhaps every major institution in the world at this point, I think, has been covered in the Kernel Alumni Network, and many of whom are here with us today. Engineers and builders from some of the top software companies, finance professionals from all across the traditional Web2 landscape and traditional finance landscape. And more importantly, builders that are getting to a bunch of incredible projects across different spaces, a lot of which in KB3 represent people that have been thinking about the later waves in NFTs and DAOs, but still many who are representing the DeFi movement and many of the other things that are happening in crypto, including things like Arweave. The philosopher of NFTs has still gone unfound, and there's still an NFT available for anyone who finds this philosopher. But for now, we'll continue on. This week is now the second of 2 build weeks. So the first 2 weeks in the program were very much about the group getting to know each other. I think what you'll notice here today in the chat is a sense of people who have gotten to get a sense for each other. So when you see messages coming through in chat and you wonder how all these questions are coming together from this group, it's because they've been able to spend some of that time together. And it's now the second week of kind of a build-focused week where you can, now that you have a sense of what kernel is about, focusing on your own adventure, what it is that you're prototyping, playing with, potentially getting in front of users or writers or editors if you're working on a thesis, whatever that may look like. So the one note for fellows that you may have seen about is Expo Week is coming. It's still 2 weeks away. So the hope is with the next 2 weeks, you're building these prototypes, you're getting them in front of at least 2 to 3 people within the fellowship, the mentors that you're getting introductions to. And then for the Expo Week, you'll have already shown this to 3 or 4 or 5 people, and you get a chance to show it in a more formal science fair style setting at Expo Week, starting 6/21. The sign-up instructions I'll put into the Slack, or maybe Sachin or Angela can help with this as well. You may have seen it in kernel announcements. We've already seen about 20 projects sign up for Expo Week. There's 60 slots, and we can potentially make more, but 60 is the number that we've definitely allocated for. So please, if you think that you have anything to show, we'd love for that to happen. So we're at a point of more internal direction and focus, although of course we've seen a wonderful outflow of Juntos, and I'm excited about a couple that are happening later this week, including later today. So with that, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to spotlight Mr. Tadho and also Sam, and we'll get into the materials for this week. The way that it starts is with the syllabus itself. So each week we go through one Web3 principle and one personal principle, which is the kind of setup for the kernel syllabus. And we're now in the 3rd week, and I'll pass the mic to Andy to explore those.
Thank you so much, as always. I was joking with Vivek before the call that it's really wonderful to have Aragorn with us as we stride across the northern boundaries and awaits the return of the king. I don't want to speak too much about the materials this week. You will find it in previous recordings on the Module 3 index page. I really want to get into a conversation with Sam, seeing as we have him here, and he's been so kind with his time. So very, very briefly, having gone through the fundamental thinking pattern, this notion of complementary opposites and what we've termed quantum thought, the ability to hold 0 and 1 in mind and the entire spectrum between them, choose with humility the correct trade-off given your own context and life experience, and how that plays into how we think about trust, meaning, value, money and speech. We now kind of move into a slightly more wider view of what it might mean to have programmable money and a technology set capable of building, so-called world machines and producing close to at least the perfect language in terms of this deterministic execution on a shared and auditable ledger. That really requires understanding two more things before we end off this first half of the kernel syllabus. The one is freedom, which is often brought up not just in Web3 circles, but also in our cypherpunk roots and various different avenues and streams that have fed into the work that we do today. And the other, and perhaps even more important, is intention. Satoshi in the original white paper calls Bitcoin a network of timestamp servers. And today we'll be lucky enough to speak with Sam about this notion of the permaweb, that these kinds of technologies which expand once again in an almost step-like fashion our ability to cast conscious experience, awareness, and description throughout time, hold us to a higher standard of intentionality. You have to be as clear as you can about what you really intend to do, because it is that which has the longer lasting effects than the short-term reaction to any given action that you take. In particular, we're conditioned by our world to think that, we're conditioned by our culture to think that it's about what we can expect of the world. In truth, you'll find across any major wisdom tradition or any minor one, all of the ones in the world points to this very simple fact that it is not about what we expect of the world. It is about being truly present and being able to answer responsibly to what the world expects of us in every single moment. This is fundamentally what intention is about. It plays into how we think about freedom, because freedom is, perhaps I think actually, Vivek, if you go to the next slide, we have a little quick discussion points. If you would like to use the Slack channel to discuss your own interpretation of freedom, how it's played out in your own life, it's really fascinating to get feedback on this from all of the different fellows and the different cultures, linguistic backgrounds, and experiences that we come from.
Yep. And I also did open up the Zoom chat to make it easy in sessions to have a kind of quick chat here. If there's anything that comes up that you want people to see later, please do put it in Kernel General for later, but would love to see anyone give a go at defining freedom and what it means to you in the slide or in the chat right here.
While that's happening, I'll come back to the freedom points when we've discussed it a little bit in the chats, just to give you a broader overview of the rest of the materials. In particular, this notion of being present in every single moment and answering responsibly to what the world expects of us and how it plays into our intention. There's a wonderful brief from Douglas Rushkoff, who's a media theorist at NYU and the City of New York University, who speaks about the present time. He had just completed a book at that time called Present Shock. And what he says in that book primarily is that the best antidotes to this present shock, this overflow of information, the fact that you have 100 tabs open right now, or trying to listen to a Zoom call and there's probably some kid crying in the background or something else demanding your attention, is to be in the genuine presence. That being in the genuine presence is what leads us to a more coherent navigation of media environments. It's what leads us to conspiring against the actual OS. This is a critical point for me, where he says, yes, it's possible that two kids can build something on a standard laptop that could potentially change the world. But the problem is that they then go to daddy at Goldman Sachs to get funding for their Series A, and you're not actually conspiring against the real OS, which is the problem here. And he makes the deeper point that the word conspire means literally to breathe together. That's literally what it means. And in order to do this, in order to really bring ourselves into the present, in order to operate with a high degree of intentionality and to build tools which promote the cause of freedom, we have to do so in a humane way where technology is being used to bring people together and to create more time, to create more time for us to relate with one another, to spend time breathing. After, do we have any?
We have quite a few in the chat, but please, Andy, go ahead, finish your thought, and then I can bring those up.
So yes, I mean, what is the cause of freedom is a long and storied post, which we can kind of we could talk about for the whole session, but really, at least the way that I have defined it in the kernel is to say that freedom is nothing other than to be conscious of the constraints within which you operate. It is, as the Buddhists say, the freedom of no escape. There is this particular way of thinking and using language should be familiar to you by now. It's definition in terms of complementary opposites or negation, right? That's really, again, in terms of this notion of present shock and genuine presence. Freedom is not to be found in some kind of idealized future where you've got self-sovereign digital identity and perfect programmable money, which is the perfect kind of abstraction, and everything works in this hunky-dory utopianistic way. Freedom is to be found here and now, or not at all. There is no other way to sort of get there. And in particular, there is this flashcard, which Vivek has kindly linked in the slides, where the question is, a life free from self-concern combines what two qualities? And it's very simple. It's awareness and acceptance. Acceptance that we experience space and time. We experience duality, up and down, happy and sad, good and bad. But awareness that within the very conscious acceptance of our own limits, there is deep and lasting freedom to be had. This freedom comes from the conscious navigation of responsibility, as this entire module is really about. And that plays into how we build our products and the kinds of narratives that we tell about them. Because if you say that you're building projects or a product to promote the cause of freedom without thinking very clearly about what freedom really is and how it operates in the world of space and time, you're just going to lead yourself into various different kinds of false marketing campaigns, which we've seen over and over again in the last sort of 10 or 11 years. In fact, perhaps the way to do this is to be conscious of and communicate clearly how we constrain the people who use our products and why the constraints are constructed in the way that they are and what they are. This kind of honesty and accountability is a feature of blockchains that seems to be different, and a feature of open source learning networks that are peer-to-peer and humble.
I want to give Sam a chance to respond if he has any thoughts. I'll put some stuff in the chat. And Sam, no pressure, we'll get to your introduction just in a moment here, which is where we can kick off. But Charles Bless, so gratefully kicked us off. He started with, freedom is free of the need to be free. Joelle continues, freedom is the ability to be authentic. Rachel and Carmen. Carmen had an interesting thought about wondering if we were talking about freedom from something or freedom to do something. Another interesting.
Right.
Adrel, freedom is the fullest expression of myself. RV, the choice to opt in only when it's enthusiastic and consensual. Sam, if you have any other thoughts, we have.
I mean, honestly, there's so much to go through there that I don't want to preempt the conversation too much, just by jumping in the middle. But a curveball, I suppose, to throw into the mix, which occurred to me, Andy, while you were speaking, was about all of this strikes for me at the intersection between free will itself and at a much more practical level, the world we have, which is more or less propped up in cyberspace by advertising, actually, which sounds, it's very mundane, if you will, like it's very down to earth, but it's true that there's this dangerous connection between how free people really are and, as you've described it, and we definitely should get into this later, but the incentives, like, whether you get funded by Goldman Sachs or a VC fund doesn't really matter, but we can get into would you say the problems that arise from that separately, or at least how that process happens, because I think people don't pay enough attention to the fact that the Web 2 ecosystem we ended up with is purely a result of these incentives that we have in the capitalistic mechanism essentially. But the thing that came up for me while you were speaking was mostly around this idea of, well, how free are people if they can be quasi-programmed by the images and the likes that they're exposed to in cyberspace? And that's a real like fundamental question that doesn't have a clear answer, because if you ask, everyone has their own interpretation of the question of free will. But what does appear to be true, like empirically true, that we can test and we can verify, and actually, we have the would you say like the capitalistic evidence of it. Marketing and advertising is one of the largest industries in the world, right? It accounts for some huge amount of revenue for Google and others. So it's pretty clear that it is effective in quasi-programming people's behavior. And that's something we think a lot about on the permaweb. And it certainly interacts with how free people really are in their day-to-day lives. But then we can also get into the other side of this, which might be perhaps even dangerous. Like you can see very clearly that in the Web3 world, everything is around incentives. And that makes a ton of sense. If we incentivize the right things, we generally get the right outcomes. But of course, this somewhat works against the questions around free will. Like just how free are you when you're in one of these mechanisms? And personally, I find it like, to some extent, the outermost mechanism of the system of societies we find ourselves in is capitalism. And it's not clear to me how free people truly are inside that system. But okay, that's a jumble of thoughts. But yeah, we should maybe get into this in a more structured, like ordered way so we can explore the ideas.
What you'll find is that the jumbling of thoughts is something we like to explore. Just starting out with as wide of a base as possible. So that's perfect, Sam. Perfect.
It is, as Vivek says, very much a feature of horizontal conversation between peers,
okay,
where
nice.
there's no single right answer. What I will say about this is that, in particular, the Western capitalist narrative, one of the things which it actively promotes is that you are free to do as you please. You have this free will, and not only that, you have rights as a human being, and you are freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, all of these freedoms which are focused on in the canon of Western literature and political organization. In terms of, and you're right that is very, very easy to manipulate, because as soon as you promise people more freedoms, as soon as the narrative is feeding into this notion that we are completely free to do as we will, then it's very, very easy to manipulate people. However, if you come at it from the other side, which is this Buddhist notion of the freedom of no escape, you are free to breathe, but even that, you have to do, otherwise you die.
Right.
Then the question in people's minds is not what further freedoms can I get from using this, it's what ways does using this limit me? And that's a far harder question on which to manipulate people. It's much more difficult to communicate in a manipulative rather than a sincere fashion in that particular way. And so if the container, the narrative that is told by the culture that we build together on Web3 is fundamentally about, look, we're all human, which means that we're limited, we're flawed, we're not free to do as we please. We have limited free will in terms of, yes, I can raise my hand now or not. I can choose to speak or be silent. I can choose what words and what tone of voice and how I relate. But outside of that, I cannot choose to breathe or not. I cannot choose various very, very important aspects of my autonomic system are not available to my conscious manipulation, all of these things, right? And so this is kind of what I intend in framing it this particular way, is that what side of the story, which is the same story, is most efficient to come at it from in order to incentivize, in the social sense, a narrative which is much more about sincerity than manipulation. And if it's all about, oh, you're free to do as you please, and this product will give you X, Y, and Z further freedoms, then that's inherently susceptible to manipulative marketing. If it's about, look, we understand that there are certain limits to how we can organize, certain limits to the technologies that we can build, certain limits to the kinds of people we can be and can reasonably expect other people to be, then that becomes a much harder narrative structure to manipulate. Not impossible, but much, much harder. And that kind of leads into the rest of there is this Nicky Case article on evolution, not revolution, which is a wonderful, wonderful example of this kind of thing, where as soon as you promulgate the idea of revolution, it becomes once again very, very easy to manipulate because you're plugging into these atavistic tendencies of sort of the evolutionary past of our biology and human nature that we carry. Whereas if you promote the cause of evolution and speak in a slightly different way about these things, you can propagate a far more sustainable culture, a far more sustainable community and way of organizing. And in particular, this digital community that's we're all kind of a part of and building together in our own unique and flawed and wonderful ways has to do, in my opinion, with these three essential pillars, which are outlined in the piece on remembering, which mixes this essay from Vannevar Bush in 45 with Michael Nielsen and Andy Matuszak's work from very, very recently. And that, building a better web, taking back the web, re-implementing or getting closer to Tim Berners-Lee's original vision, but also the vision of the people at Xerox PARC in the 60s and Alan Kay and various
Mimics.
Yes, exactly. That is to do with, augmenting our ability to think for ourselves, reclaiming our time in the sense of presence, in the sense of an intentional approach to technology that is fundamentally about the humans and breathing together and having more time to relate, and extending our ability to cooperate with these three things play an essential role. And in particular, if there was one kind of quote to sum this all up, it's at the end of the last piece on humility, which is written by Václav Havel, who was a Czech playwright who later became president after spending much time in jail for his dissenting political opinions. He wrote, "I have been given to understand how small this world is and how it torments itself with countless things it need not torment itself with if people could find within themselves a little more courage, a little more hope, a little more responsibility, a little more mutual understanding and love." And that's, I think, this notion of mutual understanding and love leads us into the introduction for the wonderful Sam Williams.
Yeah. Sam, I know that there's lots to be said there, but if you'll allow me, I'd love to introduce you to the cohort in the way that I can do best, which is the way that I've gotten to know Sam, which is mostly through his interactions with the Arweave community. Of course, he is a founder and the CEO of Arweave. Arweave has been around since the early days of this Web3 movement, and has led the way from a technical perspective, which we'll get into soon. But I think also from a community perspective, if Prashant and Tate, who are in this kernel block, are any sign, I think everyone who's engaged with the Arweave community has a sense that what they're up to there has as much to do with how they think about building spaces for positive sum games to be played amongst the founders, builders, and creatives who are building on Arweave as it has to do with the technology. And so while Andy may pepper Sam with some technical questions about how Arweave works, what the PST ecosystem looks like, what the Arweave permaweb from a technical perspective looks like, I equally hope that we spend time just exploring how kind of crazy it's been over the last year for the Arweave community to grow in a way that genuinely feels more free than I would say it was to build early stage companies in the past. So with that, I wonder, Sam, and you can take this however you please. It's, again, a wide-ranging conversation. I wonder if you could start us with a bit about yourself, this PhD program that you dropped out of to start Arweave, maybe even before that. And of course, anything that you'd like to say in response to what's already been talked about.
Okay, yeah, the first thing is something I'm not, which is defining us opposites. I am not the CEO of Arweave. The Arweave, of course, has no CEO, but I am the CEO of the company that founded Arweave. Arweave is a trust minimized protocol, so it doesn't even have a DAO running it or anything like this. It works mostly like Bitcoin in that sense of really the rules, would you say, they're forged at the beginning of the game, and largely we're just not going to change them. And there is social consensus around what those rules should be. Yeah, so no CEO, no manager, even I would say, of the network. Okay, yeah, so how did we get here? Well, that PhD program I dropped out of, I was building resilient, decentralized, or at least distributed operating systems. And the basic idea was I was looking at, can you make it so that computers can withstand damage to the hardware that they're running on and still compute things usefully? And this is largely why I sort of left in the end. It's actually a very interesting technical question, a very boring and unhelpful practical question. Like there are very few use cases for that kind of technology, but it was a fun way to spend a few years. And towards the end of it, it was about 3 months left, and and it was just after Trump was elected. And try and not get political, but we saw danger, frankly, on many sides of the political spectrum. We saw that in the West, there was a growing tendency towards authoritarianism, one way or another, that we hadn't seen since at least the 60s or 70s, and maybe even like near the end of the Cold War. Sorry, the Second World War. And so we thought, well, during the time I was supposed to be doing my PhD, I'd spent an awful lot of time reading about the development of authoritarian societies, because for some reason, I guess I'm just born that way, that I find that topic fascinating. And what we knew, my friends and I that ended up being the founding team of Arweave, was that one of the fundamental things that's required for authoritarian regimes to manifest themselves is control of the information space. I don't think anyone says this better than Orwell in the description: he who controls the present controls the past, he who controls the past controls the future. That is, by manipulating the way that people think about the past, you can essentially control the way they act, because you control the way they perceive the world around them and the new things that are happening. And you don't have to look very far into the history of the Soviet Union and the rise of communist China, same actually with Nazi Germany. All of these places made liberal use of this ability to manipulate records of the past. So we thought, well, the sensible thing to do, that's a fairly I have this theory that don't ever try and do anything too big. Everybody in society would be better off if we all just found our small corner that we can solve. And if we can do that, then together we'll solve the larger problems in a collective way. And I thought, well, hey, this decentralized technology we've been tracking since about 2011, 2012 at that point. We've been watching blockchains grow from early days of Bitcoin. It was clear that you could make a decentralized ledger of information. There was no question around that at this point. And it was robust. But obviously what doesn't work is storing large amounts of data inside. And even if you do store large amounts of data inside, the incentives just aren't there. So, I was starting to think about what I would do after my PhD was over. And I got kind of sucked down this wormhole of, hey, what does a solution to what Orwell described as the memory hole, the ability to throw away records of the past in a way such that nobody anywhere on Earth can untangle the mess and find out what really happened. What does a solution to the memory hole look like? It feels like blockchains are halfway there, maybe 75% of the way there. So we got into it, and well, I guess that was 4 years ago. Actually, yeah, it was the 3rd anniversary of the launch of the Arweave network, just on Tuesday this week, which is also conveniently the 72nd anniversary of the publishing of 1984 by George Orwell. We managed to line it up with the 69th anniversary, and so every year we get to celebrate 2 things at once. But yeah, the system grew out of this idea that we needed to find a way of storing records permanently around the world in a decentralized way where they can't be altered by any one government or any actor of any kind, actually, unless you have the collective will of all people that are willing to take part in the network. And so we solved this problem of making that sustainable, where you would broadly create an endowment structure. So instead of having a contract-based storage system where you say, okay, I would like 3 people to store this piece of data for me for this period of time, you instead say, I'm going to put up 200 years worth of storage upfront, which sounds like it's expensive. It's actually 0.4 cents a megabyte, something like that, because just storage is very cheap. I'm going to put up a huge amount of money for the storage relative to typical storage costs upfront, and over time, I'm going to generate interest on that storage. And I can use the interest to pay for storage over time rather than the principal. And now I can pay for storage essentially indefinitely within, we can get into this later, but within some very reasonable bounds of expected, storage cost decline rates and this type of stuff. So yes, we got the economics right. From the mining point of view, this was actually, say, somewhat lesser technical challenge. Really, it's a proof of capacity like system where the capacity data set is known data. So anyone can add a piece of data to the network, and then the miners are incentivized to store it in order to take part in the mining process. So that was what we built and launched 3 years ago. But then it was about 6 months after that where we realized all of this stuff was already available in web browsers. And it was an archive. It was an archive of web pages at the beginning. We were thinking really just an archive of news articles would be a good start. That would be a nice thing to make sure that humanity had a record of. It was immutable and you could verify the timestamps. You can make sure the thing doesn't change. That was a good start, we figured. But then, of course, you realize very quickly that actually, because this stuff is available in web browsers, you have a permanent decentralized web. And that was where the idea of the permaweb came from. That was about 2.5 years ago. Then 2 years ago, we had this sort of quasi-epiphany that this could probably enable you to build an open source web. So a web where the applications were open source and anyone could edit them. And critically, this is enabled by the fact that the costs for running applications do not accrue with the developer. So we did some kind of analysis, I suppose, of the Web 2 ecosystem. We saw that broadly the picture is like this, right? Like founder comes along, they have an amazing idea, they're passionate about it, they build it, they ship it, and people start to use it. And this is great, right? But then has this problem, which is, well, the more people use it, the more costs accrue to the developer. And this is a fundamental issue in the system, because this means that there is no other way out other than rapid monetization early, which leads to basically death of growth, or raising venture capital typically, but Goldman Sachs can also provide capital. Raising capital from the outside where people more or less bankroll the market domination phase, more or less, where you capture the market, and you find some way to wrap them in, not let them escape. And then at some point in the future, and during this process, the founders are losing more and more control of the thing they're building, right? Like they're giving away board seats, they're giving away equity. Like slowly they're ending up not in control of this thing. And in fairness, they've sold it to people who have very clear, very, I don't personally have a problem with it. There's this simple incentive which says, put some small amount of money into the world to get more money back. And in order for that system to work in this context of the protocol of HTTP and TCP/IP, what that means in practice is extracting value from users that are locked in. So we figured, wait, well, on the permaweb, it doesn't work like that. Users pay for themselves. There's tiny fractions of cost, of a cent to use an application typically, but they are paying for themselves. And so now you can get, like, the developer pays to upload once. We're talking like, a 3 megabyte app, maybe you call it a 10 megabyte app, it's going to cost you 4 cents to publish. And it's just out there forever. So they've paid their 4 cents, they're gone now. They don't need to pay a single cent ever again. But the users come along and they do interact with it, and they use their fractions of a cent. And this system works sustainably without having to have this sort of cost accrual with the developer. And we think that that was much closer to what was happening in the open source ecosystem that led to kind of desktop, server, mobile phone, actually, software that was open source and available for anyone to edit and play with all the time. And, iterate on and improve, which I think we can all probably agree here is a better way to do things. So we got really excited about this idea. And so did the community, actually. Within about 6 months, there were 300 of these applications out there in the world. But it wasn't until about a year later we figured, well, okay, so this open source web idea is growing, and we're getting more and more applications that are really like, they're permanent, they're decentralized, and they're open that anyone can edit them. All of the data is open. So if you don't like the UI, you just build a new interface for it, or you can remix information from this application with information from this application. It's like a big open database. So people are starting to do real crazy stuff with it, which is amazing to see. And then we figured, well, we're not competing with those incentives. So the incentive to create open source software is actually quite low. People like to do it in their spare time, but for sure, the growth of, what would you say, yeah, the growth of an ecosystem that relies upon people's goodwill and free investment of their time is going to be inevitably slower than an ecosystem where people can capture the value they created. So this got us going on like another, see Seb, who's just across from me. Seb and I went on a series of very, very long walks together. We came back with this realization that you need to allow people to capture the value of what they're doing. And you can completely invert the startup model in doing so, using tokens, but also building assets that at the same time are, have better fundamentals than both normal tokens and also stock, equity stock. So we looked at like, Facebook is the example I always pick on. Sorry, Facebook, but Facebook stock, very interesting. Mark Zuckerberg has Class A, I think they are, stock. Only 11%, right? So he owns 11% of the company, but that 11% of the company controls 57% of the voting power. So he has a majority. He can vote for whatever he wants. And Facebook has a stated, policy of not issuing dividends. Okay, so when I own a piece of Facebook, or when I own a Class B Facebook stock, what precisely am I buying? It's actually very hard to see whether true underlying value is there. I think what's happening is actually a more, almost primitive, that's not quite the right word, a more underlying version of the meme stock phenomena, which is we think, okay, Facebook big. Facebook probably going to be bigger in the future, thus I buy, which is exactly the same thing that's happened with like GameStop or Dogecoin. It's really just buying into a brand. So we figured, well, all right, if you throw out the whole web application model and you say, let's start from first principles, and where we end up is not actually so far away, it's an iteration. But if you start from first principles, what you see is, well, the first thing you should obviously do is have reasonable value accrual. That is, if I hold the token, there should be some sort of reward that is proportionate to the success of the application. More usage of the application should lead to more reward for me, that as a holder of this thing. So that's where we got to profit sharing. It's actually very simple because of micro tipping on the Arweave network, to make it so that every time someone uses one of those permaweb applications, and they've already got, like a wallet with a few cents on maybe, or a few dollars, which is very easy to get nowadays. They've already got a wallet. They can, yes, when they interact with the network with it, you can easily just say, okay, pick me a random person from the ownership table, the cap table, if you will, of this profit sharing token proportionately to their ownership share, and distribute some tokens to them as a tip on top of the transaction that I'm sending, adding data to my blog or interacting with a decentralized Twitter or whatever it happens to be. So you've got that side of things. And then, so now you have an asset where if you own 10% of the thing, you own 10% of the profit. And it's a very simple relationship. And it essentially gives you an APR almost. This was actually around the time where DeFi was coming about. And so we wondered whether we should start sort of fashioning it as like, no, you don't understand. These are actually, you can use the profits of web applications as a sort of DeFi instrument if you so desire. But we decided not to because the whole DeFi space was pretty, say, congested with some dubious ideas. We didn't necessarily want to associate our I don't know what you call it, like our new structure for startups with. So then on the other side, you have, okay, governance. Big problem for governance in startups is that basically anyone can buy a stake in the in a company, and they can take part in voting more or less immediately, maybe with a short lag, but more or less immediately. And then they can sell tokens whenever they want, or stock in this case. This doesn't seem quite right, particularly for, for example, employees that might be super passionate about the project, but have less of a stake. So there's something very simple you can do here, which is just an iteration on the old system where you say, okay, well, voting power is the amount of time you are willing to commit your capital or your ownership stake to be immovable, multiplied by how many tokens you have, rather than just the number of tokens you have. And now you get a bigger stake or a bigger say, depending on how, committed to the project you are. So that's just a little iteration, but it has a big effect on the incentives and the power of governance. And of course, because you're earning these profit sharing tips, as people use the application and the longer you're locked up, the more exposed to the, for example, if you're locked up for 3 years, you really care you're getting those tips or that APR more or less 2 years from now, right? So you're incentivized and aligned with the long-term success of the project, which is just, I think, a slightly better way of working things than you do in the typical equity world. And then we got to this final component, which is like, well, okay, if I'm a Web 2 founder, I go out and I sell equity to a VC, typically, or Goldman Sachs, whoever. I sell equity and I get back dollars, and I give dollars to employees and maybe a tiny fraction of equity, really tiny fraction, like 10th employee at a startup, you're not looking at more than 0.1% of the equity or something like this. And then you might be exposed to further dilution later. So a lot of the value accrual is in the hands of the equity holders, because the employees ultimately make the value, right? And that's accruing to the people that own the tokens, the equity in this case. So we thought, well, you can actually invert that model, right? You can say, ideally, everybody would be paid in ownership of the thing they create. So the founders don't go out and fundraise. Instead, what happens is they say, okay, we're going to agree that if you work on this for a month, I'm going to give you this many tokens. Or if this is basically co-ops. Yeah, kind of co-op-like. It's definitely a digital cooperative structure. I think that's fair to say. Yes, you print more tokens, and then you can take them to market if you want. So you can decide however many you want to sell in order to gain a salary. So you can sell 20% or 80%, doesn't really matter. And you can even do things like lock those tokens for 50% of the tokens or whatever it happens to be for like 3 months. So that now everyone in the organization is incentivized around increasing the value accrual of the service. So that is where we got to profit sharing communities. So this kind of DAO structure with this profit sharing element on top for web applications. And yeah, ever since then, things have been going completely crazy. There's a lot of these things in the ecosystem out there now. Yeah, building all kinds of exciting things, from like decentralized Twitter-like platforms, replacements for GitHub, where a DAO runs the repository, really just tons of things, and a lot of real, you could say, fundamental experiments in how value should be sort of generated by these systems. So one really fascinating Arweave project is called Koi. And the basic idea is that you have an attention betting market. So the problem with the web, one of the problems with the web as it currently exists, is that people monetize attention, but they monetize attention in this really, really negative way, which is selling access to people's future purchasing or political decisions. And it seems, given the size of the industry, we've got to assume that this actually works. It's really crazy to think that everybody's future decisions are more or less for sale for actually an excessively low value. Yeah. So what Koi does is it says, okay, fine. So what if attention was still the objective function? More attention is better, say, but you can shortcut the negative component of it by making it's a futures market for the allocation of attention. Basically, how it works is you burn some tokens on a transaction ID on the Arweave. You say, this transaction I've created, maybe it's an NFT or a piece of art. This transaction I've created, I think people are going to view it in the future more than the average piece of content on the permaweb. So you burn some tokens on it. And then in the future, when new tokens are minted, they're given proportionately to the amount of access, like verifiable user access. Yes, that goes to that transaction ID. So there are all sorts of experiments like this that are really changing the shape of the incentive design of the web itself. And that, I would say, is where the community has found its niche. It's like rebuilding and iterating on the centralized web, changing incentives first, and then would you say user experiences later? Okay, I have no idea whether that was what you wanted, but
wonderful.
There we go. That's how we got here.
I mean, it's an amazing introduction. Thank you so much. First of all, I'm really happy that you start with the political points, even in terms of that particular moment in your PhD when Trump comes up. It's not that we're a politically focused community, it's that we're just cognizant of the fact that everything that we do is intrinsically political. Even if you look at the Genesis block of Bitcoin, there is a political statement contained in that block, right? Like the tools that we build are politically motivated. To have that be conscious and explicit is in fact the whole point, because it's what allows people to think about it and to interface with it in an honest fashion. And Havel, Václav Havel, the guy I quoted just before your introduction, this is his point. He says that like politicians have to assume their share of responsibility for the long-range prospects of our world, and they must set an example for the public in whose site they work, because politics is a matter of servicing the community, which means that it's morality in practice. Morality in practice, another word for that is incentive design or mechanism design, and all of the things that we talked about in terms of profit sharing tokens and communities, which is kind of what I want to come to, because the other thing that you pushed back on with Vivek's introduction, which I think is perfect, is that you're not the CEO, right? And one of the really interesting features that I've seen just in general, it's become more and more a part of the narrative as NFTs have become a bigger part of the Ethereum world and the wider kind of impact that has had in COVID. It's really interesting to me because in the beginning, when Bitcoin was really kind of getting going, so much of the narrative was about ownerlessness, right? This is an ownerless network. There's no ownership. It radically changes what ownership means. And then all of a sudden now we're back in this world where it's all about new kinds of ownership. And so I wonder,
Please go on. I don't mean to interrupt. I'm just very passionate on this point.
Please, I wonder what your thoughts are, literally.
I think that, okay, this is so fundamental. I find it terrifying. I think we are potentially, there's a potential good outcome here. There's also a potential highly negative outcome. And I think we are veering dangerously towards the negative outcome. Yes, the promise of cyberspace is abundance of information, actually. Like the fact that cyberspace can make available to people, and the permaweb is an extension of this. Like we like to say something like, the web connected people and the internet connected people over vast distances. Well, the Arweave does the same multiplied by time, right? So it's this same idea of making more information available to more people, just on a different axis as well. I think that's one of the coolest things about the system. And indeed, where the cypherpunk movement was going. But nowadays, I see there was one particular person on Twitter. I think their we call it bio thing, where they were not claiming to be CEO. But this time, they were claiming that quote. Sorry, that's where the CEO thing came up. They were claiming blockchains have recreated scarcity in cyberspace! And I'm like, wow, yeah, that's exactly it. And I don't see that as a good thing. I see that as actually kind of terrifying. And the reason that I think it's so, would you say, paramount, is that if you look at the span of technology over time, you see that basically we are plugging ourselves in closer and closer to the machines as we go, right? We live in a world of scarcity. There just isn't enough stuff to go around. There's questions of how we distribute the stuff for now, for sure. But ultimately, we can't all live like kings and queens. There's not enough stuff, and with not enough processing power, all the rest of it. But what does appear to be emerging is that we can plug experiences closer into people's brains over time. So we started with like a mainframe, one computer per 100,000 people, and it's the size of a house. And then you end up with like the computer at the university that other people can log into. And then, it gets down to the computer in people's houses. So you share between 3 or 4 people, and laptops, and then smartphones. And it's very clear that what we're doing is plugging ourselves into this machine that can provide arbitrary experiences, more or less, that can be pleasant or negative. In fact, unboundedly pleasant or negative, with no extra cost. And the next evolutions of this are pretty clearly like virtual reality, and eventually BCI, and then somewhere along the lines, total immersion BCI. So this idea of literally implanting experiences into people's brains directly via electrical signals. Now that's somewhat terrifying, but does present an opportunity, which is, well, if you can implant experiences into people's brains, and there's zero cost difference between the best possible experience and the worst possible experience, then we have this opportunity for something that looks pretty radically better. Like it's very possible that we can make the amount of suffering in life substantially less, because we're no longer in a world of scarcity. We reach abundance that we would never be able to reach in the physical plane. So it's dark in its own way, but I think, or it's not dark per say. It's just, it gives people squeamish feelings. Like it's not comfortable to think about necessarily. But certainly if our goal is utilitarian in nature, to minimize suffering, that is kind of on the table in the next 50 years, that we might be able to seriously diminish the amount of suffering, and we do it through cyberspace. But we're facing the fact that this set of experiences that we can create exists within the mechanism design of our societies, which at the moment incentivize the extraction of value from the people that are exposed to experiences in cyberspace. And if we let that trend continue, it's very possible we end up with the ability to implant perfect experiences in the brains of almost everyone on Earth for almost no cost. But instead, what we do is we implant experiences which extract value from people. So yeah, I'm not super on board with the idea of just creating scarcity again in cyberspace as a solution to anything at all. I think that the positive way that movement can go, I think, is something like, well, actually, you know, more or less, we're highly evolved monkeys, all of us, and we come from the savannah, and we have this thing for scarce items. Like, we can't turn it off. It's just human nature. It's going to be there for seemingly until we can, you know, engineer it out of ourselves. It's more or less we can expect it to be there indefinitely. So what if we can use that to subsidize the creation of beautiful experiences that are available to everyone? One person can own it, yes, and that person is giving money to the person that created it. So there's an incentive there to, and you know, the better the experience is, and the more people like the experience, then the more people are going to engage with it, the higher the social, the social credibility reward for being the owner of it. So that has nice mechanism design. Yet all people have access to it. And you could even argue that actually the more people that have access to an NFT asset, then the higher the value of that NFT asset should be, because the more scarce and the more desirable its ownership could be. So I think that definitely is a, positive potential spin on the situation. But it doesn't, but there is also serious danger, I suppose. We stand to potentially squander the abilities that that we're gaining through embedding ourselves closer into cyberspace.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, it's just one of my.
Yeah, I want to share some of the thoughts that have been coming through the chat, and then Andy or Sam.
Yeah, I've been trying to like read while I go.
Please let me try, because it's impossible for you to speak and also see it. But some thoughts, and not in any particular order as kernel conversations go. Arcturus says human capacity for desire is infinite. As a result, scarcity will always exist in some way. The best we can do is reduce the impact of that scarcity and what is scarce. Christopher, I think, brings up an important point, which is we might be losing the line on what it means to be free in this talk, because abundance is not necessarily freedom. So just an interesting point being made there, I suppose. Well,
okay. So the first one first. I think, yes, that's correct. And you can minimize down what that scarcity is to just the basics. Like NFT ownership, I would argue, you know, if you mint your NFT on Arweave, which obviously I personally think you should, so that the asset is permanent, because, you know, otherwise your links are going to break. But that's a whole nother practical conversation we can get into if you want. But I think it's maybe less interesting, actually, frankly, than the core point, which is if you mint the asset on Arweave, it's going to be publicly, permanently, openly available to everyone. And then you've minimized that scarcity component actually down to just a tiny fraction, which is like for the people that want to take part in the game of ownership, there is a game to be played, and there's value associated with it, and incentives and all the rest of it. But in the practical sense, it becomes like a public park. Anyone can get the Beeple NFT, have a look at it and enjoy it. You know, no one's going to be able to stop them, and no one will stop them. So I think like the positive potential outcome is something like that. You know, we're essentially using that desire for scarcity to subsidize the creation of experiences that are pleasant and available to all people. That'd be my hope.
That's amazing. I I do want to jump in because, I mean, Sam, I have literally like 1,000 questions for you, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. What I do want to say just about this particular thing is that it's fascinating to me that ownership in this particular context becomes much more like stewardship, because your responsibility, in fact, the best way you can play the game of ownership here is to share what you have as widely as possible, so that it has the widest cultural impact. And that's
right.
a fundamental change in how we think about ownership. In fact, the deeper point, which gets to what Christopher is saying as well, is that all of the major like wisdom traditions, and in particular a book is linked in the intention post called The Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which he wrote
Which is
after
an
he came out of
incredible
Auschwitz.
book. That was one of the ones
Amazing.
I read during my PhD when I should have been working on the operating system. Unbelievable. That book will change your life. And same with Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. They're both the complements, and reading them both together gives you a comfortable both sides of the spectrum. There's no feeling of left and right extremism. You can see the fact that these issues emerge on all sides of the political spectrum. So I would recommend them to be read in tandem. But anyway, or One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich as well, shorter than the Gulag Archipelago.
We'll put together a Goodreads list after this talk. But what I wanted to say about this thing in particular was that Frankl and pretty much every major spiritual tradition in the world comes to the same point, which is that you own nothing except your ability to respond. It's just that. All you have is the choice around how you respond to whatever situation you find yourself in. And that's really what blossoms for him in this deeply embodied sense in Auschwitz. And it's just something to think about in terms of, you know, freedom, ownership, and this current matrix of things that we're talking about, that, you know, ownership changes to stewardship, the ability to share, the ability to cultivate responses rather than extract value. And that's something which to me sort of seems quite interesting. But I do also, as I say, I've got 1,000 questions. And one of the things which strikes me as most interesting about Arweave, the yellow paper, and what you've put together is, in that paper, you know, one of the things that you say is that Arweave, the network itself, is likely impermanence, although the data which is stored on it is permanence. And that this is a reflection of the sort of technological cycles that we go through, but also these wider archival cycles. So for instance, Gopher Space, which is like an old sort of bulletin board, is itself stored in Arweave, and Gopher Space itself stores an archive of Telnet, which is the previous one. And then, you know, the Library of Congress is mostly online these days. And in fact, books themselves tend to be archives of other previous writing, right? So, yeah, exactly. And I'm really very interested, you know, one of the sentences from that paper, you say, after the mining of the final block, the financial incentive mechanisms for data preservation will subside and give way to social incentives for data preservation. And given this thing about ownership and responsibility, and can you discuss this link between financial and social incentives as it applies to these kind of archival cycles that we see in technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think so there's lots to say about that. For a start, we don't think that last block is going to be for like a very long time, hundreds of years at this point. But for sure, we don't, you know, it's natural to assume that one day there will be a final block. The interesting questions, and you can think about this from a pure mathematical mechanism design point of view, is like, okay, at that point in time, what is the burden, if you will? We call it storage burden. What is the cost burden for maintaining a replica of this data set? And of course, it used to be, and so we think that that burden is going to be very low for a whole bunch of reasons we get into in the paper, but like, you know, should be extremely cheap. And the information should be socially valuable to some extent. And subsequently, the disincentive and the incentive modifier should equal out to, you know, someone has an incentive somewhere to keep replicas of it. And I think most likely, I don't know what the engine of such a system would be. I would assume it would be an endowment structure built in a different way. So not looking at storage cost declines, which are actually more reliable than, you know, financial investments of almost any type over the last, I was going to say 50 years, but actually it's quite interesting. You can span this out over thousands of years because the cost of transmitting data has been declining long before we had hard drives. Humans have always wanted to do it, but the cost of it has always been expensive and then decreasing. But anyway, I imagine they'll be replaced with some kind of system with a different endowment structure. But who knows? That's for people in a few hundred years to think about. Yes, I think the linkage is a social incentive but my guess is it goes into something that has a financial incentive to propagate. And then on top of that, you know, a few hundred years after that, maybe 1,000 years, hard to know. You get the same thing again. What I would say is, you wonder whether these protocols can become something like paper and pen at some point. Like it feels to me intuitive that something like a collective memory is such a fundamental thing that it could get very, very deeply ingrained in a society. And you know, the protocol sync theory, this idea that basically like protocols are interesting and powerful really because they don't change. And we all agree on the rules of what the protocol is. So the one I always think about is like a power plug. In our respective countries, our power plugs, you know, the formats do not change very often, very, very infrequently. And subsequently, the power plug kind of becomes ubiquitous. Whereas if the power plug was changing format every other day, you wouldn't have them in your house. Actually, you'd have some other system because nothing could stay compatible for long enough. And paper and pen, I think, is the ultimate version of that. People have been using this for, you know, I guess, well, a quill, at least for what, 1,000 years, something like that. You can imagine that at some point, the data ledger might be just so primitive or it's so fundamental to society that actually it becomes like that paper and pen. And so the protocol, you had a nice name for it, the sort of protocol loops and archival loops, they get very, very long between them. But that's, anyway, yeah, I could talk about this for hours, please.
It's
yeah.
fascinating. It's really, really interesting to me. And, you know, as I read that, I was like, okay, what the hell are these social incentives that you might actually be speaking about? And sort of later on in the paper, you actually mentioned some, which would, for instance, be like running an Arweave IPFS bridge or non-token social rewards, including things like data distribution and RQL query prioritization, which for me are fascinating like examples of social incentives, because it's not this like social hand wavy thing that we talk about of like a feel good community thing. They're very, very specific and relevant to, you know, like the fact that your plug has to go into the wall in a particular way and it has to have a particular current flowing through it and a particular voltage, otherwise it'll break your appliances. And it's that kind of thing. And the context in which you're talking about these kinds of social rewards is really the adaptive interacting incentive agents. So Arweave is fascinating for those of you who haven't looked into this, because they have this notion of non-consensus based adaptive metagame being played. I mean, I know what each one of those words means on their own, but together it's kind of difficult to understand.
It's like the least understood component of Arweave, I would say. Yeah, it's super interesting.
In particular, Sam, to focus the question, one of the quotes that I pulled, which I think is just totally fascinating, particularly given that in module 5 about tokens in kernel, we talk about programming pro-social behavior in the context of computer games. And this notion of adaptive incentive agents, you say this pattern of rewarding pro-social behavior reciprocally can be viewed as a generalization of BitTorrent's optimistic tit-for-tat algorithm, from bandwidth sharing to generally useful behaviors. Tell us more about that, man.
Well, since we wrote that paper, we've come up with a simpler word for it, which is simply karma. Actually, it's this basic principle of you don't have consensus around social reputation. But what you do is you simply log who is doing what to whom, and with yourself as the center, actually. And so the nodes are just keeping track of a score, if you will, of the behavior of other people. And then there's this really interesting thing that happens in BitTorrent, which is the optimistic component of optimistic tit-for-tat, which means basically, imagine like the way they had laid it out originally, for reasons I don't understand. I don't think we're very I know, non-optimal, but whatever. They were pioneering, and you know, it was amazing stuff. But like they said, okay, imagine you've got 4 slots. 3 slots go to reciprocal behavior. You do something for me, I'll do something nice for you. Easy. And the 4th slot, we just randomly do nice things for each other. And the fascinating thing about this, and this is mathematically provable, is that the Nash equilibrium of this game is that everybody is, in the case of BitTorrent, sharing data with everyone else all the time. And this is not theory. This is a beautiful, would you say, I was going to say, reality. Like, I find this fact truly extraordinary. This incentive system, which everybody that played with BitTorrent kind of understands how it worked. Like, the more I seed the more I get to teach, right? This eventually accounted for about 35% of the internet's traffic at Bitcoin's peak, BitTorrent's peak. So I would say, at least 3 years ago, I would have said that it was the most powerful and effective mechanism designed to have ever been tried on the internet or in a decentralized network. Although, to be honest, I think nowadays we can pretty clearly see that Bitcoin has outdone this. But nonetheless, it's unbelievably powerful and has nothing to do with tokens. And of course, you can take that same idea and say, well, why does it have to be bandwidth that they're sharing? Like, that's a useful thing. But what about, for example, if someone was to run an IPFS bridge inside Arweave, which is one of the things you can do? Like, this is a pro-social thing for the people that mine Arweave, because they all have a vested interest in the value of Arweave tokens, which they are accruing while they're doing the mining process. And so it's helpful if a few people run these IPFS nodes. And so you can just detect when that's happening, and you modify your score for that person or node to be higher. And so, yes, you get like let's say a generalized idea of pro-social behavior incentives through this. But then the really weird part comes when you realize that actually multiple of these games can be in play in the same arena, if you will, at one time, right? So someone's playing the stock. The first version of this game was called Wildfire in Arweave. But someone can modify Wildfire so that it also rewards based on this IPFS thing. And so now if you are another node in this network, nobody is enforcing that the rules of the game are the same. And so actually you're playing multiple games simultaneously. And so your best strategy is the mix of the strategies, of the dominant strategy, it's called, in each of the sub-games that's being played simultaneously. It's a meta game of games, exactly. And then comes the final component, which gets even weirder, which is the game of generating games for others to play. And this, we don't have a strict mathematical proof for, but we have some simulations that appear to show that over a long enough period of time, people are incentivized to incentivize others to do pro-social things for the network. And in that way, we have what we call adaptive mechanism design, the idea that the mechanisms in the network can shift over very long periods, of their own accord, but towards pro-social ends. Anyway, yeah, that's Aya, we call it for short. It's pretty wild stuff, to be honest. I can't believe people don't pay so much attention to this, because it's super, super cool to me personally.
Yeah, it is. I read the paper in preparation for this call, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I'm walking around the desert in South Africa being like, this is insane. If it really works, it's amazing. I mean, I referenced, in fact, one of the Kernel Fellows papers in last week's call, but I'll do it again. Matt Stevenson wrote an incredible paper on game theory and the difference between public goods games and coordination games, how public goods games in particular are great for statements of the problem, and coordination games, because they have different stable equilibrium, are good as means of, like, if you can shift the equilibrium in your game towards a coordination game, then you can find a solution. And he has this wonderful diagram in that post of sort of like go round and round and round. And if it is like genuinely a public goods problem, there's probably no solution. But in fact, if we can have an adaptive incentive design, we can try again and try again and try again and try again until, as you say, there are enough people playing these meta games, games on games on games, designing games for other game players to the extent where we come to, I mean,
to a fixed point that is pro-social. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's a fixed point that is pro-social. It's remarkable stuff. And I wonder, my last question, I know Vivek is probably really pissed off with me now that I've taken so much time to get you. But my last question on this is, like, given that there is this archival cycling that we're seeing, that's and this combination of IO, adaptive interacting incentive agents, you know, the big problem highlighted by Vannevar Bush in 45 was we can store the record, we can record human knowledge, but we cannot consult it. We really, really suck at consulting the record. This is what the mnemonic media and all of Andy Matuszak's work is about, and having, you know, mediums that help with memory specifically. And I wonder, you know, how does Aya and seeing these kind of larger, long-term cycles in how we interact with our knowledge, how can that help consultation?
That's interesting. I don't know that IR is the right level, because IR is between like node operators. So these are people not necessarily responsible for ingesting the knowledge graph, if you will, but they're the other layer. They're the service providers of the knowledge graph. That said, one of the things I've always wanted to see built on Arweave is almost exactly, I called it breadcrumbs, but they call it trails. This idea, so the way that I imagine this would work is that as people navigate the permaweb, you can just like send a transaction to the network, and you can use it like a database, so you can query those transactions back very quickly. You send a transaction that says, I went from here to here. I was on this page. I clicked on this link. And if you do this, and then you display it to the user by, in my mind, for some reason, I've always thought of it like some kind of sparkling effect around the links that people click most often. Don't know why, but that's the case. But whatever, you display in some visual feedback. Like when I'm on a page on the web, I want to know actually what the other monkeys like me, slightly more evolved monkeys, what they're interested in seeing next, so that we can tap into the, well, they're kind of like pheromone trails for ants, right? Like the ants are all kind of doing something that's probabilistic and stochastic. And you can also do back propagation. So you can say, if I went down this track, people that went down this track were more likely to find more or less the information they were looking for. So find the page they were looking for, or they stopped browsing, or they went back to another tab. There's multiple ways you could, you can measure that. Yes, but it's so clear that we need pheromone trails on the web. You could very easily build it in Arweave and make it completely decentralized, and everyone could trade in them. I've even wondered whether you can make mechanism designs around people making good trails for others, but I think that's a little bit out there. I bet there's something there, but I don't have the answer on that one. But yes, certainly the idea of trails around the web is super important and not very well understood, or not very well explored relative to the knowledge preservation side of the protocols, which even like HTTP was doing, just different axes, right? Like the axis of space rather than axis of time multiplied by space.
I'm personally incredibly excited for that particular game to be incentivized. The trails that you, Sam, for example, have taken to get to the ability to write some papers that you guys have done. Genuinely, like, I don't want anyone else's. I just want to see like what and I want that for everyone. I want that for Andy, and we kind of have it with syllabus, which I'm very grateful for. And I think that those trails also have many other pro-social elements to them, right? It allows for relationships to be built based upon shared interests, almost built in what it is.
Wow.
So there's a couple of people in Kernel talking about this. Amy Jung specifically, she led many things at Maker, is exploring how NFTs might be useful for this, looking at Arweave.
Wow. Cool. Yeah, I'd love to help if at all possible. Cool. This is a project I've kind of been theorizing about for like 4 or 5 years, so I'd love to help if it's available.
Incredible. No, you've been so generous with your time. I know you had a really important meeting that you moved for this. We're very, very grateful.
Nice.
I'm kind of in my head thinking about whether we should ask some questions here or we should try to do breakouts. My instinct says to ask at least one question. Some really good chatter came up when you started talking about endowments, which is a while back, but I'd like to pull on it a little bit. If I can find it in the chat, LOL. So a couple of things. Ali, who's worked with some foundations, he mentioned something just as framing. He works with larger foundations. They only give out about 5 to 7% of funds a year. 5% is required by law in US, which is interesting. They often make as much in investment income as they give, which is interesting. And then Dhruv asked the more specific question. Dhruv working on some interesting smart contract security problems, also a couple of projects, but his question is, do you believe DeFi, or do you believe anything that exists can be the endowment system that you're thinking about? And maybe you could expand a bit further on just what you're thinking.
Well, I mean, I personally think that, okay, so Arweave, we're in a bit of a special situation, right? Because we can bet on storage purchasing power, which is actually something where it's very easy to generate interest. It's extremely reliable. In the real world, we're looking at about a 30.5, so 30.5% declining storage cost per year on average for like 50 years. And I would also argue that it's harder to get statistics for. That pattern goes back like thousands of years. If you see, actually writing a single book, and again, I'm afraid I can't be clear about the dates here, but writing a single book in like 900 or 1000 AD, it took like a serious amount of time. Like it was a real investment just to make one copy. Because someone had to sit there and write it out. And the number of people that were actually literate enough to write was, of course, very, very few. So declining cost of storage, we chose as the one that we could use. And we put an estimation of about 0.5% in the network. So as long as we stay above 0.5%, it goes indefinitely. And even if it were to stop or even reverse potentially, like very occasionally happens, there was a tsunami in 2011 or 12 that took out, I think, 30% of the world's hard drive production. And so that was actually a time where the price spiked. But then you still have 200 years worth of storage, which is enough to get us into this sort of social incentive area where it'll just get nested inside something else. I think for what it's worth, those social incentives are actually pretty strong. Like if you're building a compendium, there's definitely a social incentive to do that. There's a financial, not even necessarily just social, but financial reward too. So as well as the kudos, you actually get money for selling the compendium. But that's aside. Do I think DeFi could give the endowments? In theory, but sure as hell I would not do that today. Like the state of DeFi today is about 15 years too immature to be trusted with something this serious, I think. Like realistically, most of the yields in DeFi, like the vast majority of them, say 90% plus, just come from printing tokens that are the governance token for the protocol. And in a lot of cases, I think there's real questions to be asked around the fact that, well, it's all a little too recursive. It's what do I use the governance token for? I use the governance token for voting on how new governance tokens should be printed in reward for various pools that I put tokens in to get more governance tokens. It doesn't feel sustainable to me, and I think it stinks of some of the more, I would say, kind of depressing characteristics of crypto as an industry over the last 5 to 6 years, at least, where I'll be frank, print a lot of shit coins, and they don't necessarily have real long-term value. However, DeFi does have a lot of promise in the real long term, and once things mature, for sure you can use it to generate endowments. I actually think it's one of the less looked at uses for DeFi, and I think that's probably because it's all focused on long-term thinking. There's actually something really interesting that came up in the Arweave community and ecosystem recently. This is something I had never considered until someone did it. It's really cool. They made essentially a kind of profit-sharing token endowment fund. So anyone can come along and deposit profit-sharing tokens into this wallet address, which is centrally controlled for now, but they want to decentralize it. And of course, over time, that means that it accrues tips when people use those applications, and they just donate those tips over time to charitable causes, which is really cool. It's essentially an endowment, a little bit of a different structure. So yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff to look at there. And definitely eventually DeFi should get to a point where it's mature enough to be trusted for this really long-term thinking type stuff. But right now I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, as they say.
It's
in the
really
UK at least.
Fair enough. No, and that model, I mean, it's something that we're actively kind of thinking about. We've been really grateful that, for example, in the kernel context, there have been a variety of projects that have ended up either building out or recently kind of like doing different types of token launches and pledging small amounts of token supply back to the kernel treasury. And it's kind of an open question for us on what do we do in those instances? How do we leverage that pool in a way that continues the game? But it's definitely one that's close to my heart as we think through these things. It's funny, I think I'd rather pass the mic to Andy for one more question, if there is any, because we have Sam and us
I
doing.
only have questions.
Yeah, I apologize.
Still thousands of them.
Yeah, we will do like 5 minutes of breakouts, I promise. For anyone who wants to stick around and stay for like 10 or 15 minutes, the room will remain open. But while we have Sam, I think this will be a wonderful talk to look back upon for a long time. So, Andy, please.
So, I think that the one thing I will also say is that the word endowments is perhaps a little bit misleading just in this context, because like the endowment that Sam is talking about exists in the protocol itself. It's a really fascinating way of dealing with storage costs over time, as opposed to the Filecoin approach where you establish a contract with various other parties, as he mentioned. It's worth reading the paper, like really just read the paper and it sort of makes a little bit more sense. But in response, Sam, to what you're saying about the sort of social incentives again, and some of the like really icky parts of DeFi and some of the more negative tendencies and too recursive strategies that we're seeing, I wonder, like I have, as you can tell, this deep interest in the sort of social incentives. And in Arweave, one of the ways in which you've spoken about moderation, which is again a whole nother talk, but like the third defense against is this notion that, gateways which serve content from the Weave can implement their own content policies. And there is this very explicit distinction between the sort of reality of data on the Weave and the reality of its social use through any given gateway, right? Exactly. Yeah. And you have this beautiful quote, which you say, we expect that communities of like-minded individuals will coalesce around gateways according to their content policies, maintaining and advancing the way that they wish to see the web together, which really echoes a lot of what we find in kernel. But I wonder if you can reflect in these last few minutes for us on how we can use adaptive incentives to ensure that like-minded individuals can find and coalesce around the content policies that they like without slipping into echo chambers and the kinds of negative and toxic behavior that we sometimes see on the web as it stands at the moment.
Two related, but both deep and interesting questions. I'll try and get to both. Okay, let's see. So, actually, let's do it the other way. Let's highlight the limitations or the potential areas of difficulty. And I think one of those is people coalescing around content policies without creating political power games for the control of those content policies. This is something that's going to be, I don't know if it's avoidable. I would hope that it is, but I don't know at this point whether that's possible. Because I think that as people continue to adopt the permaweb and gateway policies become more and more important, the people will need a gateway policy. Like you don't get to not play the game. Like you have to choose one. And when that happens, power is going to accrue to the people that control them. You can start putting that into DAOs and this kind of thing. But I'm personally of the opinion that like DAOs are great only in as far as they are programmable organizations. And in fairness, lots of organizational structures around the world, there's quite a lot of legal freedom to program them how you like. So this is an incremental, I would say a small incremental improvement, if not, what do you say? If not leveraged in the right way. I'm personally of the opinion that protocols are cool because they are trustless, right? So you do not have to worry about Arweave telling you, we're only going to store your data for 10 years now. No, if someone tried that, they would fork the protocol. Arweave, just like Bitcoin, has 21 million tokens. Arweave is not going to shed data. So you can trust it in that way. I don't know that you can use DAOs to govern a content policy in that form. It feels like maybe you can. Maybe you can do some sort of incentives for curation and this kind of thing. But it is certainly tricky. And I wonder whether what happens at the end is you get people basically coalescing around more or less political parties as content policies. So they see the web through this lens of their political affiliation. Now, stopping that turning into echo chambers, also a very tricky question. I don't know that there is an answer. I think that free speech, what are you going to do? You're either going to have enforced exposure to everybody else's opinions, or you're going to have closed speech. I think it's pick one. The nice thing I would say is, in fairness, the protocol is open to lots of different potential ways that you could build on top of it to address some of these problems, and people will, and there will be many experiments. And I don't imagine myself to be prescient enough to know what they're going to design, but I'm sure that, I know there's a design space out there. I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting things they try. But yeah, no doubt, it's a real and interesting problem. But we tried to, at the protocol layer, do the most, would you say, reasonable compromise, really.
Sure, it's an honest and good answer. Thank you for it. My one thought for you is that when money and speech are not separate things, the collapse in that particular distinction perhaps means that it's not just free speech or closed speech. There is some kind of middle way to be walked. I once designed an algorithm which did that, but we'll talk another time about it.
Okay, that's a shame. Okay, I'd like to know. I think one of the things that's not well explored in, in the decentralized protocol community is that, smart contracts aren't limited to just tokens. Actually, quite the opposite. There's so much you can build out there, but a lot of it is not. The incentives aren't nearly as high. It's kind of like open source permaweb apps. You can build them. The incentive isn't as high as like tokenize, have the scarce resource. Now it's valuable to others. That game is extremely reinforcing. I don't think that's quite the right word. It's extremely powerful nonetheless. And so people tend to play it, but they're missing things like, well, what if you have non-transferable governance rights, for example, that accrue to you for taking part in something? So you can't trade them. They're not a token in that sense, but you can certainly earn ownership or participation in a protocol during that system. But there's a ton of different things you could explore in that area. And I think you're right that, some of the solutions, some of the experiments people run are likely to play with those kind of games.
Yeah. Maybe in a future kernel, we can have you back for week 5, which is tokens and mechanism design. I think it's a whole other type of conversation that we could have. There's space to explore.
Fascinating.
Yeah, Sam, thank you so much for being here. For anyone who's on the call who's keen on looking into Arweave further, we're lucky in Block 3 we have Tate Berenbaum and Prashant Warrior, both who are working on projects that are doing really well in the Arweave ecosystem and kind of know the deal in much more ways than just the technical. So Sam, if there's any other ways that you would like to mention to people, please feel free.
Arweave.org is obviously the homepage. Just go check out what's around. But the dev Discord server is really where the conversation happens. So if any of this piques your interest, just jump in there and say hi. And there's always like 6,000 people around chatting about interesting things on the permaweb. Anyway, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity. It's been super fun. And thank you, Andy. It was very well thought through questions. And touching on some of the in my head, I accidentally maintained this curve of the interestingness of questions of the people that I encounter when they talk to me about what Arweave is. And this is right down on the far edge of the rare and very exciting questions. So thank you.
Amazing. That's why I keep Andy around, even when he asks 10 more questions than he's allotted.
You can beat me later. It's fine. I'm willing and submit myself to it. I know that I've been badly behaved, according to Vivek. But Sam, it reminds me of that curve. On the left-hand side, the sort of troll face being like, I asked the most simple question I possibly can. In the middle, it's this huge complicated thing about what the hell is going on with mining incentives and how does moderation actually work with democratic voting and stochastic processes and blah, blah, blah. And the other side, the hooded figure being like, I just asked the most simple questions I possibly can. So
it's like the traders, they say, you be smart and I'll be rich or something. Like sometimes you can overthink these things. Anyway.
All right. I think we'll open up breakout rooms just in case anyone wants to stick around, but Sam, please don't feel free to you have to stick around, and we'll continue with a clubhouse, and it looks like a Junto got posted for this weekend if anyone wants to dive deeper but can't stick around now. But thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Sam, again, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks everyone. See you.
Let's see here. Just gonna make 13 rooms, maybe, for anyone who does want to stick in. How's everyone doing?
I think it should be like 7-8 rooms.
What's
Doing
going
all right.
on?
What's up?
Party in here, it seems. Oh, Irvin's here.
Yes. What's up, Vivek, Andy,
How's it going?
Sachi?
Hey,
Yeah, man.
¿Cómo
Alicia.
estás, Evan? ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, muy bien. I'm still in Miami.
Oh man,
Oh,
you couldn't leave, eh?
Yeah.
Cool. Alicia is our star podcast host here now. Thank you so much for Crypto Native episode 2. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Cool. See, Chris is on a beach too. He's like, yes, confirmed. Okay, good talk. Cool. I think I opened up breakout rooms, did I? No, I didn't do it. Okay. You don't have to join. You can stick around here if you want to too. Okay. Oh, Z is here. Hey, Z. I think Anna is here. Gotham. Maria. Okay. People are sticking in the rooms.